The goal of this online module is to provide an overview of various practices of forced migration that occurred in Eastern Europe throughout the 20th century that span the spectrum of evacuation, removal, deportation, expulsion, population exchange, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide. So it's important to start this discussion by providing some key definition of the terms that we are going to be using. In the 1990s, in the context of the Yugoslav civil wars, international observers introduced a seemingly new term to describe aspects of the military campaigns targeting civilian populations: ethnic cleansing. And I invite you here to read several definitions that were provided by the experts working for the United Nations. What I'm showing here is also an image from the gravesite of Srebrenica, the cemetery that international community sponsored to commemorate those who were lost, when over 8,000 Muslim boys and men were separated from the rest of the population by Serbian paramilitaries and executed and buried in mass graves as a demonstration of this act of ethnic cleansing that could acquire genocidal proportions. And the link between ethnic cleansing and genocide is important here because we have had a definition of what we understand genocide to be, a definition that was necessary for us to understand the magnitude of the crimes committed in the context of World War II and the Holocaust. However, often that definition provided too high a bar to be able to prosecute perpetrators internationally. Therefore, it was also necessary to distinguish between genocide and ethnic cleansing to be able to provide a sense of justice for the victims of those crimes. However, the link between the two types of crimes against humanity is clear. What I am going to further argue here is those two types of atrocities, ethnic cleansing and genocide, were in fact a part of a larger process of making, throughout the 20th century, of making forced migration a legitimate international tool of handling populations. In the course of the 20th century, what we see is the rise of state violence in the context of war, but also in the context of the aftermath of the war, when we see the state bureaucracies directly involved in the perpetuation of violence through the use of state infrastructure and state resources. And in this context, many scholars talk about aspects of what they call population management or population politics, or the radical handling of populations who are seen as undesirable, as foreigners, as enemies. And this is exactly the context in which forced migration became one of these new administrative tools that the state used vis-a-vis populations that were seen as undesired. In the context of forced migration, what we think in the early 20th century is how we are experiencing the initiation of a brand new practice of population management, that is population exchange, the exchange of populations, the virtual swapping of populations in territories for one or another. And typically population exchange is implemented in the aftermath of war with the intention of separating people who had fought against each other, with the goal of preventing violence and providing financial and economic assets for the adaptation and resettlement of the affected individuals. But again, population exchange has various manifestations. Sometimes it is intended to be a voluntary population exchange, giving the people the option to relocate. However, very often it acquires the dimensions of a compulsory population exchange. So the argument I'm going to also introduce here is that population exchange could actually lead to additional violence and additional chaos, and could radicalize in a way that might become an aspect of ethnic cleansing as well. And I also want to pay attention that there have been different terms used throughout the 20th century to describe different aspects of these policies of forced migration. And I have listed some of these terms as they developed during the 20th century. I wanted to pay attention to the first category here, the term the unmixing of peoples was used by the British diplomat Lord Curzon, who was serving as an international observer in the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I, and who in this context was suggesting that the international community should be implementing the unmixing of people belonging to different religions and speaking different languages. And in fact, this obsession with unmixing became a core practice, a core logic, actually informing the various practices of forced migration during the 20th century, because the logic of unmixing or ethnic unmixing went hand in hand with the aspirations of nationalism to create nationally homogeneous, nationally pure territories, which would be void of ethnic minorities, which will be purged from undesired ethnic minorities. So all of these policies that I'm going to be discussing today are only understood in the context of nationalism and nationalist obsession with ethnic and national and racial purity, as opposed to the mixing of people and mixing populations. That's why I think it's legitimate to describe all of those practices as practices of ethnic unmixing. Again, this obsession with ethnic or racial purity was key. Now, two further clarifications before we start examining the historical examples. I am mainly going to focus here on the period of the first half of the 20th century, and going to look mainly at events surrounding the Balkan Wars, World War I and World War II, which in the context of these military conflicts, we see the implementation of increasingly radical policies of population management. So we will follow the evolution of these policies, and we will focus mainly exclusively on the area of Eastern Europe. And here I'm using the term Eastern Europe as a geographical designation. Those maps, especially the map on the right, will allow you to see what are the territories that I'm mainly going to focus on, even though that I'm also actually treating, for the purposes of our examination, Greece and Turkey as part of the larger area of Eastern Europe. There are various terms that historians use to talk about Eastern Europe: Central Europe, East Central Europe, Southeastern Europe. Here, for my purposes, I am designating Eastern Europe to mean the lands between Germany and Russia, and their peculiar processes occurring in these lands. That will be the focus of our examination. So let's begin with our historical examples. And when we think about the precedents that led to the formalization of population politics, of population management, of forced migration, is a key tool for handling populations, we really need to look closely at the years of the wars in the 19-teens, the years of the Balkan Wars between 1912 and 1913, followed by World War I between 1914 and 1918. And I want to emphasize that for some places in Eastern Europe, the entire period between 1912 and 1918, and sometimes well into the 1920s, was a period of war, of fighting and military campaigns and disturbances and uncertainty. So that was a time of non-stop conflict. The Balkan Wars began as a war between the Christian allies of Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece against the Ottoman Empire. So the Christian allies fought together against the Ottoman Empire. However, disagreements over how exactly to split up the lands of the Ottoman Empire led to the escalation of tensions between the Christian allies, and then led to the Second Balkan War, in which Bulgaria fought against the rest of the countries, namely Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, but also Romania, as well as against the Ottoman Empire. So the entire region of the Balkan Peninsula experienced extremely harsh military campaigns in which prior allies had now become enemies. And because the goal of all of the powers was to split up the territories of the Ottoman Empire in Europe among themselves, one of the techniques that they used in order to be able to claim these territories was to target civilian populations that were deemed to be detrimental to their own national causes. So now you see the armies, but also paramilitary formations targeting civilians because they did not speak the right language, they did not follow the right religion, or they did not have the right ethnicity. And in this context, we see the mass flight of civilians who fled their villages and towns as refugees and fled to neighboring territories where they could have security and protection. And as you can see from some of these images here, very often these refugees were actually women and children, because the men were summoned to fight. The men were rounded up in the various armies, or again in the paramilitary formations. Perhaps some of the most dramatic movements of people that occurred during this time period was actually the flight of Muslims who were now fearing the Christian armies and who were fleeing in huge numbers their original areas of residence, and actually they were trying to get to the Ottoman Empire. The numbers are unknown, but some historians put the number upward of 1 million Muslims who now fled as refugees from the Balkans. And in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, because of the magnitude of civilian casualties and because of the level of violence, there was an international commission constituted whose goal was to look into the development of the conflict and how it affected civilian population. And the observations and the records of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace investigation clearly show us patterns of behavior vis-a-vis civilian populations that constitute practices of ethnic cleansing, because people were often targeted, again, because of their religion, because of their language, because of their perceived ethnicity, and purged from specific territories which the rival nation wanted to claim for its own country. So even before the emergence of the term ethnic cleansing, we actually see the institution of practices that could be described with this term. So here it is interesting to actually have this conversation. Can we talk about ethnic cleansing before the term is coined, before the term is defined? And what do we lose and what do we gain when we use this term to describe these practices? Now, after the end of the Balkan War, unfortunately, 1 year later, what we see is that Eastern Europe, and particularly the Balkans, were engulfed by violence again, because World War I started in 1914. And the context of fighting throughout the European continent. What we are seeing now is further radicalization of these policies of population management. And I also want to emphasize that these were policies that were not used just by Eastern Europeans vis-a-vis their populations. In fact, many of the Western countries were using very similar policies. What we think is that in the context of this great war, now all of the countries were implementing radical measures of population management that included, for example, the internment of dangerous foreigners to special internment camps, the deportation of foreign citizens who were deemed to be dangerous for the security of the country. And here you are seeing in these pictures, in particular, pictures from Great Britain, which in the aftermath of the eruption of World War I actually rounded up German citizens who were now, of course, fighting on the opposite side, so they were seen as dangerous. And the situation was similar in Eastern Europe. On the Eastern Front, one might actually argue that World War I was even more dramatic because it truly saw the clash of the four empires, the Russian, the Austrian, the German, and the Ottoman Empire, which were all fighting and advancing their various goals. And also the various Balkan countries had their own agendas as well. Because of the vast amount of territory that the war on the Eastern Front covered, what we're actually seeing, the constant swinging in the border between Russia and Germany and Austria-Hungary as the military campaigns advanced and then retreated, as the troops went forward and then again withdrew. What we're seeing is this constant change of the line of the battle, and that covered vast territories, and often populations fled the various armies in a process that Peter Gattro has described as a whole empire walking on the shifting borders between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one hand, and the Soviet Union and Russia on the other. So you have millions of people who are now fleeing military conflict as refugees. So what we think is, with the radicalization of these policies, now we have a vast increase in the number of people who could be described as refugees. And I'm going to return to this point in a little bit, because we are basically seeing the emergence of the modern notion of a refugee as a result of the war. But also importantly, World War I and the fighting, the military campaigns became a pretext and cover for even more radical population solutions that led to the first genocide committed in areas adjacent to Europe. And of course, I'm talking here about the Armenian genocide. Between 1915 and 1916, the Ottoman Empire, which was of course also fighting against Russia, and this is the border between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. The Ottoman Empire wanted to prevent the formation of an Armenian independent state, and also used the war as a pretext to claim that the Armenians were collaborating with the Russians. And using this pretext, it started rounding up Armenian populations and marching them literally from their homeland to the Syrian desert in extremely harsh conditions where people had no access to food or water, and many perished in the process. But also Ottoman authorities and also paramilitaries slaughtered, literally massacred hundreds of thousands of Armenians. And this is the context in which we have the targeting, deliberate targeting and elimination of one particular population defined as an ethnic group. The Armenian genocide claims between 750 and over 1 million victims. We don't have the precise numbers, but it was in the context of war that the Ottoman Empire managed to launch this absolutely systematic policies of targeting the Armenian populations and eliminating them because they were deemed to be enemies. Many of the surviving Armenians fled the Ottoman Empire and they went to Europe and they also joined the rank of refugees, which helped actually create a positive image for the plight of refugees in post-war Europe. As did another group, and this is the group of white Russian refugees who fled Russia in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. When the Bolshevik Revolution began in the midst of World War I in 1917, it led to the withdrawal of Russia from the conflict. But then with the victory of the Bolsheviks, a civil war ensued between the Bolsheviks on the one hand and representatives of various formations still loyal to the emperor, to the Russian Empire. Many members of the clergy, members of the officer corps, members of the bureaucracy, their families, and also anyone who deemed that they will be in danger under the Bolshevik regime. Often these people fled the Russian Empire because they feared for their life. And then their arrival in Europe, in Western Europe, raised awareness for the plight of refugees. Now, what we are seeing during and immediately after the Great War is really the birth of the modern conception of a refugee. As a result of the conflict, in the duration of 4 to 6 years, because in some areas, actually the worst refugee movements that occurred after the war, not necessarily during the war, but in the aftermath of the war. As a result of the conflict, between 10 and 12 million people were forcibly on the move. In other words, were subjected to various practices of forced migration and thus became refugees. So in the aftermath of World War I, what we are seeing is the beginning of the codification of the modern conception of the modern term referring to refugees. I'm providing you here with a contemporary term. However, I think that this term, which is broader and more inclusive, captures quite nicely the reality of who were the refugees, people fleeing war, violence, conflict, or persecution, and who cross an international border to find safety in another country. I believe this is a very precise, but at the same time broad definition that allows for the accommodation of various circumstances. So what you are seeing is in the immediate aftermath of the war, people thinking actively about the plight of those millions of people who had fled their countries in search of safety. And that became an international problem. The plight of the refugees led to international involvement. The newly constituted League of Nations established a new international organization, the High Commissariat for Russian Refugees, whose goal was to provide help to the white Russian refugees in particular. And that organization was under the leadership of Fridtjof Nansen, pictured here, who actually received the Nobel Prize for Peace because of his work on behalf of the refugees. And this organization became the precursor to today's United Nations High Commission on Refugees. It had a more narrow mandate because it was focused on one group of people, but nevertheless, it established important policies that governed the way international institutions and organizations treated refugees in the years to come. So World War I was a watershed in many ways, and it was also a key period in which we see the experimentation with another practice that I want to discuss here, and that is specifically the practice of population exchange. Population exchange was first practiced in Southeastern Europe in the Balkans Actually, the first instance of population exchange on a small scale occurred after the Balkan Wars, when a population of about 100,000 was swapped between the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, right here. But in the aftermath of World War I, that practice was expanded to also accommodate other population. And again, the goal of population exchange was to proactively fix the ethnic composition of problematic areas that had seen as the cause of violence, or that had been seen as sort of like potentially being able to cause more violence. The first internationally sanctioned population exchange took place between Bulgaria and Greece. The two countries had fought against each other both in the Balkan Wars and World War I, and both countries had claims over the same territories, and these are these territories that formerly belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and the borderlands between these territories that victorious Greece actually ended up incorporating in its territory in the matter of World War I. And in order to pacify the situation between Bulgaria and Greece and help with calming down the situation between the two countries, which had fought as enemies for more than 10 years, the League of Nations included in the peace treaty between Bulgaria and allies a convention for the voluntary and reciprocal emigration of minorities between Bulgaria and Greece. And according to that document, basically the document guaranteed the voluntary choice of each individual to either remain in their place of birth as a minority, or to relinquish their current citizenship, relocate to the other country which they perceived as their national homeland, and to receive compensation for their real estate left behind. In other words, the convention had provisions which allowed people who felt insecure in the aftermath of the war to be inhabiting a country that saw them as enemies, as foreigners, allowed them the financial means to relocate to another country, but also guaranteed that they will receive compensation for their properties left behind, that then they can use as money that will help them with accommodation and adaptation to the new country of residence. So there was an elaborate process, and these are some of the documents associated with the convention, an elaborate process by which people could file a declaration for emigration, list their properties, their family neighbors, and testify that that from this point on, they wished to be considered citizens of the other country. Under the provisions of this convention, more than 150,000 people actually left their territories. Some of them did that voluntarily, but actually very few people did so. What ultimately happened is that increasingly over the course of time, people experienced extreme pressure. Peer pressure from nationalists in their own communities who wanted to see them go to the other country, but there were also people from the rival ethnic group who wanted to get rid of minorities from their own reasons. So they were putting pressure on minority populations to file declarations for emigration and go to the other country. So even though this population exchange was envisioned as voluntary, in the end, it ended up actually triggering additional migration and compelling, forcing many individuals to sell their properties, to resettle, and to permanently relocate to a different country. And for some of these people, that was something that they did not necessarily desire, but they ended up having to do because of the various pressures that they experienced in their local settings. Now, when we talk about population exchange, the most dramatic case, the most dramatic example of a population exchange that occurred during this time period was the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War of 1920-1922. After the end of World War I, the Sèvres Treaty between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies put this area on the Asia Minor coast of what is today Turkey under Greek administration and occupation. And as the Greeks started landing on the coast, on the Aegean coast, they actually started expanding their control over the area, triggering the harsh reaction of Turkish nationalists who mobilized to defend their land, their country, what they saw as their rightful country, rightful land against what they perceive as the Greek invaders. And a war ensued between Greece and Turkey, which raged for 2 years, which was conducted in an extremely harsh way, in which saw the spread of massacres against civilian populations throughout the area. And you can see in some of these maps how badly affected the entire area of Western Anatolia was as a result of this war. People fled violence in huge numbers. That process escalated after Turkish nationalists entered the port of Izmir, Smyrna, which was the site of actually the location of an important, significant, prosperous Greek merchant colony, and set that city on fire, causing even more chaos and more refugee flight, as people were desperately trying to leave Smyrna on vessels sent to them by the Greek government, which was trying to help them evacuate. But there were simply not enough ships available for people to flee. So you're seeing here these overcrowded ships and people being left behind because there was no way to accommodate everyone. And in the aftermath of this humanitarian tragedy, there was another conference and another peace treaty negotiation that ensued that led to the signing of a new treaty for the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which had important consequences because it actually led to the creation of the Turkish Republic and reversed the territorial arrangements of the previous treaty. But most important for our purposes here, it also sanctioned a population exchange, because previously in January, there was a convention concerning the exchange of Greek and Turkish populations signed. The goal of that convention was to stop the violence that had already uprooted so many hundreds of thousands of people, to stop the violence and also to help the people who were already fleeing relocate, accommodate, adapt to new places. What is interesting here is that this population exchange used the criterion of religion. So it spoke about the exchange of populations defined as religious rather than linguistic or ethnic minorities. So that was a compulsory exchange. No one had the right to stay behind. A compulsory exchange between Greek Orthodox Christians living in Turkey, who now had to resettle to Greece, and of Muslims living in Greece, who now had to resettle to Turkey. There were some small exceptions that were, there were some populations that were allowed to stay in place on the reciprocal grounds. So small exceptions, but the vast majority of Muslims and Greek Orthodox Christians had to be exchanged. And we are talking here cumulatively upwards or close to 2 million people, of which about 500,000 of Muslims who fled Greece, and close to 1.5 million Christians who fled the Ottoman Empire. Now, something that I want to emphasize as I am discussing this treaty, that because of the treaty and because of the practice of compulsory population exchange, that was not a population exchange applied only to areas that had suffered extreme violence. That was an exchange that was also applied to areas that had been actually able to avoid violence during the war. So there were people who never experienced massacres and fighting who actually now had to relocate to the other country under the provisions of this treaty. And what you're seeing, extremely dramatic situations in which people are literally given a week, a few days to gather their belongings, to dispense with their property, to be able to organize their lives so that they may embark on a boat and leave and go to the other country. So now, as a result of this convention for the compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey, what you are seeing is the systematic, radical removal of populations defined by their religion, under the supervision of the international community. And again, if we return here to the definition of ethnic cleansing, what was happening with the removal of these populations, one might claim, actually reminds very much practices of ethnic cleansing, by removing, by purging territories of populations that belong to a particular ethnic group. So the goal might have been to stop violence and to help with the accommodation of refugees, but actually the effect of population exchange was that it mandated the forced relocation of people who had not been affected by war and violence previously. And by doing that, the outcome was to purge territories from people who didn't want to resettle, but they had to because of their religion. So, as I mentioned, upwards of 2 million refugees, 2 million people became refugees as a result of this population exchange, and both Greece and Turkey faced extremely difficult conditions of accommodating such vast numbers of people. In particularly in Greece, that was a very dramatic development because Greece was exhausted after years of fighting, weak, and lacked economic resources to accommodate 1.5 million refugees. And again, in this context, what we see is the intervention of the international community. The League of Nations actually helped with the accommodation of the Greek refugees by helping building refugee villages, by financing various agricultural projects to be able to provide people with the means to survive. But what the Lausanne Treaty did, and universally, internationally, it was considered to be success. If you read the proceedings of international negotiations, of international conventions, of diplomatic negotiations, you will see that politicians universally saw Lausanne as a success. What we should ask here is, does really the practice of compulsory population exchange constitute an aspect of ethnic cleansing? And was this in particular a process of ethnic cleansing sanctioned, encouraged by the international community as intermediaries? And what gives international observers the right to classify or to term the execution of the Lausanne Convention as a success, given the fact that the people who were actually targeted for removal, for forced migration, often did not want to do this. And then they faced conditions of deprivation and the need to adjust to a completely foreign environment in order to serve as this example of, quote, unquote success. So there are a lot of things that one can think about and discuss in the context of population exchange. What exactly happened in 1923 and what sorts of precedents did it create for future developments of this radical population politics that I am discussing in this presentation. Because ultimately, if we start examining subsequent events, what we are going to see is that extremely dangerous precedents were set in the early part of the 20th century, because as a result of this perception of Lausanne as a success, forced population movements, forced migration was now seen as a legitimate tool of unmixing population. Is, let me emphasize, successful tool for unmixing population. So when the next global conflict happened in Europe, only some 20 years later, in the course of World War II, we see the institution of even more radical policies of population movement, which often also included forced population movements, the movement of forced laborers, but also the exchange of populations. And the cumulative numbers of people who were subjected to forced migration during and after the Second World War in Europe are truly staggering. Some 60 million people at one point of the conflict or the other had to move against their will, because of this normalization of the concept of forced population movement as a legitimate, successful tool of managing populations. Now, in the context of World War II, there is no doubt that the most radical policies of population management were reserved vis-a-vis the Jewish populations, first the Jews in Germany, but then all the Jewish populations under Nazi administration. And what we are seeing is, as the conflict evolved, as World War II escalated, so did the Nazi policies of population management vis-a-vis the Jews. With the beginning of the war, the Nazi bureaucratic machine immediately started thinking about the option of emigration, because it wanted to get rid of the Jewish populations. So there were various plans where exactly those Jewish populations would be sent to, in order to not, in the racial thinking of the Nazis, be contaminating German soil. So the Germans were thinking in terms of emigration, even to Madagascar, off the coast of Africa. But then when the war evolved, they started moving Jewish populations further to the east. And very soon after the war developed, they started opening up ghettos where they started putting Jewish populations in these ghettos, and even reservations. So they were rounding up entire areas and emptying them of Jewish populations and taking them to ghettos. And then, of course, as the war escalated, and I'm not going to go in detail here because this history is known well, as the war escalated, by 1942, the architects of the final solution had already come up with a comprehensive plan how to go from the removal to the destruction of the Jewish population of Europe. So in the beginning of 1942, we see the final solution, followed by the mass deportation of Jews to extermination camps, which became operational by the summer of 42 and which continued functioning by the end of the war. The technology of genocide was put in place, It was activated. It included the use of state bureaucracy, state infrastructure, technology, again sponsored by the state, and which led to the killing of more than 6 million individuals, people who were targeted because of their perceived belonging to a hostile racial group. So again, you can see this escalation of the policies of forced migration, how we can go from removal to destruction under the cover of war. And I want to point out that in the process of coming up with the final solution, Hitler was very much also looking at the experience of the Ottoman Empire with the Armenian genocide and studying that experience. So we know for a fact that actually the architects of the final solution were looking at the lessons of those prior precedents, which they used for their own goals. However, practices of forced migration did not end at the war's end, at the end of World War II. And in fact, you might claim that on one level, it accelerated after the war's end. Because in 1945, after the end of the war, in August of 1945, what we see is that the victorious Allies authorized the so-called transfer, this is the word that they had used, transfer of Germans from territories where they now, they were part of minorities to Germany, but also of other populations of Poles, of Ukrainians, that was connected to the shifting of the border of Poland. Poland was basically moved 200 kilometers to the west, and territories that previously belonged to Poland were given to the Soviet Union, and Poland was compensated with German land for these territories that were given to the Soviet Union. So Poland was literally moved up to 100 kilometers to the west, and those territories that were previously inhabited by Germans were now subjected to the transfer of those Germans out of these territories to Germany, and similarly territories that were given to the Soviet Union, you see the transfer of Poles out of these territories to Poland. So now you have another population exchange, which is termed transfer. Between 14 and 16 million Europeans were swapped under those provisions, and in the process, more than 1 million people died. And again, the vast majority of people who were transferred during this time period were again families, women and children, because the men were often still fighting or they had not been demobilized. So we have now again the international community actually using the precedent of Lausanne as a success, its perception of the Lausanne Convention, the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, as a success to justify what it thought would be an orderly and humane transfer of populations in the aftermath of World War II. And the magnitude of this transfer is so huge that some historians of modern Europe actually talk about the ethnic cleansing of Europe. As a result of the transfer, the European territories would emerge as nationally homogeneous as they ever would be. So what are the lessons of this historical example? What should we be focusing on from this historical experience? And what I really want to dwell on is the fact that there truly is a slippery line between population exchange, transfer, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. And that in fact, they are part of a spectrum that can go from voluntary population exchange, in which people are supposed to be having some agency to decide whether they want to move, to practices of genocide, where people are physically exterminated for who they are. Now, the goal of population exchange is to proactively fix the population composition of territories with the goal of preventing more violence. But it is clear from the historical experience that population exchange has the propensity of creating more chaos, more volatility, more violence, because generally people don't want to leave their homes if they're given that option. Just for that reason, population exchange could become the pretext and actually the manifestation of ethnic cleansing, because it deliberately removes groups based on their religion, on their language, on their ethnic characteristics from particular territories, because the goal here is again to unmix territories, because the mixing is seen as a problem, as an aberration. So from that point, we're just so close to the next step, because once radical policies of removing populations is in place, the probability of escalating violence goes up, especially in conditions of war, often leading to genocidal policies that not only remove, but actively destroy communities and individuals for the sake of national or racial purity. So it is this destructive potential of population exchange that I would like to point out one more time, because practices that are perceived to be as beneficial, that are perceived to be as a success, could actually lead to the worst types of crimes against humanity that we have known in history.